We started this series by working up to what I'm calling the Lacanian third. Not the one and not the other, but their irremediable division. Not S1 and not S2, but again, their irremediable division. This is the Lacanian third. If the one refers to the imaginary and its other, the other, points to the symbolic, where does their irremediable division pop up? Where do we find this third between the one and the other? That's neither one nor the other. Where does this lead us? Not just where do we find the irremediable division, but where does it lead us as well? To the real? No. The irremediable division between S1 and S2, the one and the other, does not lead us to the real. It leads us instead to the doorstep of the real, what I've called the threshold of the real. You see, as a figure of impossibility, here of impossible union between the one and the other, S1 and S2, irremediable division functions as a gap that can't be closed, a lack that can't be filled, or in keeping with Seminar 22, a hole spelled H-O-L-E that can't be plugged. To call irremediable division a threshold of the real is thus a little bit misleading. What we encounter in experiences of irremediable division is less a threshold on which to stub our toes than a hole in which to twist our ankles. What is the real relative to this hole in which we can twist our ankles? Well, we can say that it is something beyond this hole, something outside this hole, something exterior to it. You see, if irremediable division is a hole in existence, the real it indexes is an open field beyond, an exterior domain that relative to this hole, we can only determine as existing. Here, X with a hyphen, sisting, that famous Lacanian coinage. And here's the deal. You can't have existence without that hole. No irremediable division, no encounter with the real, no hole in existence, no existence beyond. Lacan is adamant on this point in Seminar 22, in a passage that must be carefully retranslated from the original French, for better and for worse. Here's the passage. It's from page 32 of our packet. In order for something to exist, there has to be a hole somewhere, Lacan argues. It is around this hole that existence is suggested. Now, I said for better and for worse regarding the mistranslation of this passage. Let's read the mistranslation because this is the for better part as well. We get actually something gained from this mistranslation. Indeed, it's quite instructive. Here's how Chadwick translates the passage. Instead of exist and existence, he offers exist and existence without a hyphen, despite the obvious hyphen in Lacan's original French. Like most slips, I would say, this one carries a certain truth. Existence without the hyphen also requires holes, and it's around these holes that existence takes shape. Between the pen and the hand, it's not a hole which conditions the emergence of the pen as an apparently singular and unique figure of existence. So no hole, no existence, but also no whole, no existence. And you could just say the same for illustrative purposes about the hand, the face, the voice, and so on. The existential phenomenology of each is premised on a gap, opening, furrow, or hole between it and all that it is not. Lacan has a word for this each in Seminar 22, and it's one you heard in the last lecture, consistence. Lacan's word for existence without the hyphen in Seminar 22 is consistence. To exist for Lacan is to consist, to stick together, to hold together in an apparent figure of oneness, singularity, and completion. Emphasis on the word apparent. Hence, Yadlun, that something of the one we've been discussing since our series on Seminar 19b, or worse. At issue here is not the one, but only ever something of it. A something that is only ever a seeming of the one. Hence my emphasis on the word apparent. What then is consistence for Lacan, and by extension, existence without the hyphen? It is an image of oneness, an illusion of singularity, a figure of completion. In short, a seeming to be. This is what consistence means to him. Let's be precise here, using his terminology. Consistence for Lacan is imaginary. And let's even be a little bit schematic here. Consistence in the imaginary, existence in the real. And both, this part is key, conditioned on the operational logic of the whole, again spelled H-O-L-E without the W. You see, in order for something to consist, there must be a whole somewhere in it. And in order for something to exist, there must also be a whole somewhere. Question: are these wholes the same? Consistence and existence, are the wholes on which they are premised the same? Yes, they are. Consistence and existence both take place around the same whole. Where then do we find it? Where is this whole? Simple. The whole around which consistence and existence take place is in what consists. And where does existence sit, or more precisely stand, relative to this whole inside what consists? How the hell am I supposed to know? How the hell is Lacan supposed to know? Nobody knows where the hell existence stands relative to the whole in consistence that conditions them both. I don't know. Lacan doesn't know. You don't know. Nor do any of the other brilliant psychoanalysts and dense philologists tuning into this lecture. All we can say is that existence is out there, beyond the whole and its surrounding consistency, beyond the withdrawn structural void that is this whole, and the surface, manifold, contour, boundary, envelope that contains it, that encloses it, that encircles this whole with consistence. As we've learned, Lacan has a word for this surface, manifold, contour, boundary, envelope that contains, encloses, and encircles this whole. And the magic word Arguably the most magical word in all of Seminar 22 is consistence. But check this out. We don't yet have a word for the interior, missing, withdrawn void that whole suggests. At least in Seminar 22, there is not an equivalent word for this whole. So I'm going to risk one, just until something better comes along. And the better that comes along may be in the very next live discussion of Seminar 22. It could be years from now, when this lecture is watched by somebody who comes up with a better word and emails it or posts it in the comments. I don't know. But in the meantime, I want a word for this whole. We've got consistence for the boundary or manifold around it. What do we have for the whole itself? I'll risk the word absistence for this whole. Absistence is what withholds presence, allowing only for absence in and as consistency's interior domain. The whole that constitutes the interior domain of all and any that consist, we call absistence, because it is a withholding of presence, allowing only for a display of absence instead. This is how I'm using the prefix ab here, not just away, as in abjection, to throw away, but absistence, which means to stand in a withheld or holding back position. To ab is also to withdraw. So here's how it shakes down. Absistence within and existence beyond. This is what illusions of consistency sustain. Absistence within, there's that whole, and X with a hyphen sistence beyond. This is what illusions of what consists sustain. And note the emphasis here on spatialization. Absistence within, existence beyond. Absistence, in keeping with the structural logic of the whole, which is always a whole in something. Think about this. You can't have a whole unless it is in something. This word absistence points to an interior void that can and must be located. You can't not locate an absistence. Why? Because it's always a whole in something. It's always circumscribed, enveloped. Hear me now, encircled. See any circles on your screen right now? We can always determine where absistence is. The same way we locate black holes in space, if you think about it. We find these holes by studying what's around them. The same way we locate black holes, by studying atmospheric turbulence just at their limits. Call it a sac, call it a subject, call it a galaxy. This atmospheric turbulence, what is around these holes, this is what consists around them and what shows us where they are. A sac with a hole in it. The sac is what shows us where the hole is. A subject with a lack in it. It's by way of the subject that we can circumscribe and understand the lack. The black hole with a galaxy, sometimes even a galaxy of atmospheric turbulence around it. It's by way of the atmospheric turbulence around that we can begin to study the whole within. Existence, however, is way more elusive. We know it's out there, in and as the open space beyond whatever consists around the missing space within. But that's about it. Hence, once more, God's knowledge for Lacan. Meet me on page 11 of our text, or just listen up. God's knowledge, Lacan says. It is certain that it exists. We have enough trouble spelling it. It exists, but only in the sense inscribed by me of the term existence, which is to be written differently from the way it is normally done. It exists, perhaps, but we don't know where. All one can say is that what consists gives no evidence of it. Terrific passage. So let's see if we can put all of this sistence into a sentence. Consistence provides us with ample evidence of absistence, but none whatsoever beyond suppositional logic of existence. Here it is again, one more time, in a sentence. Consistence gives us plenty of evidence of absistence. But we don't have anything in what consists that evidences what exists beyond it. Emphasis here also on suppositional logic. It's by way of suppositional logic that we approach something like existence. Notice emphasis also on the word approach, not access, but approach. All right, zooming out for a second. Why the hell am I working through all of this here in our series on Seminar 22? Because absistence, consistence, and existence are the basic structural logics of the Borromean knot. The same knot that's been on your screen in every lecture so far in this series. The knot that you can close your eyes at this point and probably envision. The knot that Lacan has been redrawing and rethinking in this period of his thought. What, I ask you, are each of the rings in the drawing of the Borromean knot on your screen? Each of these rings is an illusion of consistency, for reasons we've discussed. Why, again, is it an illusion of consistency? Because each is a flattened, two-dimensional drawing of what is in fact a contoured 3D, three-dimensional topology. And which topology in particular? This is the key point. The torus. You know the torus? You remember the torus? It's that donut-looking geometric shape with a hole in the middle that Lacan has been drawing and discussing for years by the time we reach the fall of 1974. The torus is crucial to understanding what's up with the Borromean knot and each of its consistent rings. Why? Because this donut-looking geometric shape is constituted by a hole. A hole in it that is not accidental, but structural. You simply can't have a torus without a hole in it. Nor can you draw its basic two-dimensional planar shape, namely the circle, without also simultaneously, indeed structurally, including or interiorizing and thus locating a certain hole within it. Whether we're talking about a torus or a circle, the geometric object or its planar shape, neither consists without an interior void, in short, a hole. So also, my friends, with the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, as represented in Lacan's drawing of the Borromean knot. Each is a torus turned circle, structured and made to consist around a certain hole. And you know each of them. What do we call the hole in the real? Life. What do we call the whole in the symbolic? Death. And what do we call the whole in the imaginary? The body. Which is why, again, in the Borromean knot on your screen that you've seen before, I have written life in the real, death in the symbolic, and body in the imaginary. My students in the undergraduate classroom often ask all kind of crazy questions. Some even ask questions about the meaning of existence. Now, maybe not in those words. I don't teach in a philosophy department. But variations on the question of the meaning of existence pop up all the time. But let me tell you, if they're student Lacanians, as so many of them are at this point, they often ask about the meaning of existence instead. Or more precisely, as Lacan puts it on page 35 of our text, the question reads as follows: how does existence exist? There you go, buddy. There you go. I hope it's not too early in the morning there for you or too late at night for you to keep up with this one. But Lord have mercy, Lacan's question here is, what does existence mean and how does it exist? Woo-wee! This, I think, is the million-dollar question of his later teaching, because it's the question that puts us on the path of the real. How exactly does existence exist? I don't think we can answer this question. We certainly can't answer it, as Lacan puts it, on the basis of what consists, much as we can't answer the question of God's knowledge on the basis of whatever consists for human being. But we can begin to answer this question, I think, by studying whatever makes a whole in human consistence, and three human consistencies in particular: real, symbolic, and imaginary. Lacan is explicit here. On page 35, it's a rather lengthy passage, but it is absolutely one that we're going to work up to one step at a time. Here's the first stage from page 35 of our packet. Existence, as such, is defined, is supported by that which in each of these terms, RSI, makes a whole. There is in each something by which it is on the basis of the circle, of a fundamental circularity, that it is defined, and this something is that which remains to be named. In each of Lacan's three registers, real, symbolic, and imaginary, there is something through which, not just around which, but through which it defines itself as circular, by way of what Lacan here calls a fundamental circularity. It is this something that in each case still remains to be named. For each of Lacan's three registers, something remains to be named at the level of the whole that constitutes each. At this point, we now know what this something is: a whole, an interior void, a withdrawn structural absence. But I think we also know how to name it in each of Lacan's registers. Once more, life is the whole in the real, death is the whole in the symbolic, and the body is the whole in the imaginary. Real life, symbolic death, and the body imagined, these are the wholes around which Lacan's registers consist, allowing themselves to be drawn here as circles. And don't just take my word for it. Consider Lacan's own. But also don't just take his word for it, but also, as he so often resorts in moments of great conceptual breakthrough like this, Freud's word as well. Notice where Lacan goes from the passage we just read on page 35. It's in the very next couple of paragraphs. It's a lengthier one that I'm going to read. Close your eyes, lay back and imagine, or if you've got the text, even better, meet me on page 35. The very next sentences from the one we heard. It is striking that in Freud's time, that which is not named is only imaginary. I mean that the function, for example, of the self is this something of which Freud, in accordance with that necessity, with that bent which makes it that it is to the imaginary that substance as such goes, Freud designates what of the self? Nothing other than that which in representation makes a whole. He does not go so far as to say it, but he represents it in that fantastic second topos. Whereas the first marked the aloof amazement at what he discovered of the unconscious, it is the sac of the body. It is from this sac that the ego comes to be figured. A representation that makes a whole, giving us the image of a sac, the sac of the human body. It is from this sac that the ego comes to be figured. We're talking about the imaginary here, in which, moreover, this induces him to have to specify about this ego something which would precisely create a whole by necessarily letting the world that this sac is in some way blocked by perception. It is as such that Freud not so much designates as betrays that the ego is but a whole. The ego is a whole because it is derived from the body which functions as a whole in the imaginary. Moving on to the other two registers. What are these wholes, Lacan continues, that constitute on the one hand the real and on the other the symbolic? That's what we will no doubt have to examine very closely. For something assuredly opens itself up to us which seems in some way to be self-evident, and that is to designate the whole of the real as life. And that's a direction that Freud himself did not resist, opposing instincts for life to instincts for death. I note that by using our knot to interrogate the structure made necessary by Freud, it is on the side of death that the symbolic function is found. It is to the extent that something is primordially repressed in the symbolic, that there is something to which we never give meaning, although we're capable. It's almost the same old song to state it, capable logically of saying all men are mortal. This last bit about the symbolic function being on the side of death has got my wheels turning. What exactly is the symbolic function? Is it nomination, the giving of names? Sure. How about signification? Yeah, of course. What about repression? It's here, it's queued up. Repression, you bet. Repression is a symbolic function. All of these functions are being performed by way of what? In the field of the symbolic, the word here is signifier. It's by way of the signifier that nomination, signification, and repression occur. And what's the signifier again? It's what represents the subject to another signifier. And what do we find in the subject, once more, in that classic Lacanian subject? Once again, we find a split, a gap, an opening, in short, a hole, or as we are calling it, an absistence. If consistence is the function of the imaginary, and existence is that of the real, could absistence be the function of the symbolic? The same function Lacan here locates on the side of death. If the symbol is a tombstone, as you've heard me say, maybe the signifier is a grave digger. In other words, a hole maker. I don't have any answers to these questions. Like I said, they just got my wheels turning. I do, however, have a few hunches. So we'll just leave it at that. Hunched over, without a support staff, like good imbeciles. In leaving it there, hunched over, without a support staff, we would take a bit of a risk, however, and it's worth noting what this risk is. Think about this. Consistence in the imaginary, existence in the real, absistence in the symbolic. This is a little too clean, wouldn't you say? The cleanliness of this triad ought to give us pause. Why? Because all three of these functions, consistence, existence, absistence, they're in fact more dispersed than this in Lacan's diagram. Real, symbolic, imaginary, all three registers are shown to consist, as you'll recall. So also is the not that they constitute. There is a real consistency, a symbolic consistency, an imaginary consistency, and the not, so-called not, that they constitute in this Borromean diagram also has a certain consistency. We go on. Each register, in consisting as a torus turned circle, also bears an interior void. In other words, each also carries with it an absistence. And not just one absistence. Take a close look at the diagram on your screen. As we're going to see, there are several holes, several absistences, 4 to be exact, in each register. Moving on to existence. It's also everywhere in this Borromean drawing. This is also going to become apparent as we get going on this thing. In fact, I would say only that little A in the middle of the typical drawing of the diagram, only this one eludes existence. And just because I love jumping ahead of ourselves, we'll write the little A where it belongs, right in the middle of things. This is one that, if you ask me, at this point in our reading of Seminar 22, seems to elude existence. We'll see where we go with this. Call it a wager. My point here is the following. Consistence isn't just reserved for the imaginary, even if that's where it most applies. Absistence isn't relegated to the symbolic, even if that's the register's operational result. And existence isn't unique to the real, as drawn in Lacan's diagram, even if that is its true home, so to speak. What else, I wonder, can we say, or at least suggest, about real life, symbolic death, and the body imagined? Well, I would say that in addition to holing out their respective registers, I would say that they are constitutive of a certain economy of jouissance. Real life, symbolic death, and the body imagined call our attention to a certain economy of jouissance. Where the body imagined intersects with symbolic death, we find meaning, which is how I'm translating Lacan's sens, S-E-N-S. Chadwick gives us sense. I do not think that's correct. I think the proper translation of sens is meaning. Where the body imagined intersects with symbolic death, we find meaning, which brings with it a certain enjoyment, which I'm inclined to label surplus. I'll write it up here where it belongs. And I'll keep it in French so that you can be the judge in terms of how you want to translate this. I call it meaning. Sense is okay, but meaning more precisely is what Lacan means. Meaning is what takes place between the imaginary and the symbolic. The body imagined and symbolic death. I write it up here where it belongs. And again, I'm inclined to call meaning a certain type of enjoyment, a jouissance, if you will, that is fundamentally a surplus enjoyment. We'll come to that in due time. What about this intersection between symbolic death and real life? Where symbolic death intersects with real life, the symbolic and the real, we find phallic jouissance. Here written J capital Phi. And again, I label our diagram so you can see exactly where Lacan wants to put this thing. J Phi, phallic enjoyment between the real and the symbolic. Between real life and symbolic death, we find phallic enjoyment. And I would also note here that he is no longer dabbling with the lowercase phi as an option. It is the capital Phi, the capital symbolic, if you will, phallus, that he is linking to jouissance here. It becomes relevant, a little more clear as Seminar 22 develops. But note that at this point, that's not a lowercase phi. That is an uppercase phi next to capital J for phallic enjoyment. And how about where real life intersects with the body imagined? Here we find another aspect of this economy of enjoyment. Here we find what Lacan calls other jouissance, here labeled J-A. And that A is capitalized. Now, if you want to be technical about this, and you really want to think this thought to the end of the line, that will eventually become a barred big A. But for now, the way Lacan is writing it here is J capital A as the enjoyment of the other. In yellow on the diagram in your screen, labeled is an economy of enjoyment. Each, you'll notice, occupies a peculiar hybrid whole, an absistence we might call intersectional. Imaginary and symbolic in the case of meaning, sens, symbolic and real in the case of phallic enjoyment, real and imaginary in the case of other enjoyment. These are all hybrid intersectional zones or wholes that are opened up. But note this as well. Each jouissance also functions as a certain existence. And this is where things get a little squirrely, so hang on. Look at the diagram, and if you don't have it on the screen in front of you, draw it out for yourself or return to Seminar 22. Go to wherever you get your complete diagram of the Borromean knot. Take a close look at this thing. What you will see is that meaning, sens, is exterior to the real. It is literally written beyond the circle of the real, beyond the register of the real. That's where meaning is. Phallic enjoyment, that J phi at the bottom of the diagram. Notice, it is exterior to the imaginary, and with it a certain understanding of the body. How about that JA, that other enjoyment? Notice its position in the diagram. It is exterior to the symbolic, and with it, that uniquely death we know as symbolic. Meaning here is beyond bioanimal life, we can suggest. Phallic enjoyment is somehow beyond bodily representation. What an odd thing to say. But Lacan is explicit on this, especially in his third Rome discourse. He calls phallic enjoyment an out-of-body experience, or core. It's an out-of-body experience. How are we to understand this? Other enjoyment, just to round out this puzzle, this thing exists beyond lethal signification. That is the suggestion here. And lest you think I'm talking crazy here, lest you think all McCormick's marbles have rolled off the table at this stage, remember this. Meaning is what we seek in the dictionary, not what we encounter in the trees from which its pages are formed. In our jouissance of the word, we know nothing of the tree's enjoyment. Other enjoyment, that JA, this is the enjoyment of a body sexed other, namely a body sexed feminine. Other enjoyment here is the enjoyment of a body othered, sexed as other, which for Lacan means sexed feminine. Symbolic death is precisely what feminine enjoyment outlives, even if only partially. And what about the other bodies, the rest of those bodies sexed masculine? Aren't they entirely governed by a phallic function that denies them access to anything like a whole body spelled with a W, whole body? Aren't they denied access to a whole body? And isn't this precisely why those motherfuckers never stop insisting that one exists? I hope you're having formulas of sexuation pop up in your mind's eye when I say this, that the body sexed masculine that is entirely governed by the phallic function and thus occupies the little spot in the bottom of this diagram labeled J phi. To occupy that space is to live a life in which you are denied access to anything like a whole body, an image of a whole body. Which is why these folks never stop insisting that one exists, that there exists at least one who is whole, autonomous, singular, who enjoys without constraint. You see how this is starting to link up? Let me tell you what I propose at this point. We're still getting into Seminar 22. I propose that we consider each of these enjoyments in turn. The only way to make sense of them is to take them each one at a time, dig in, and hang on to our hats. We can start with the jouissance of meaning, followed by that of the other sexed feminine, followed by that of the one, or I should say the wannabe one sexed masculine. Can take them each in turn. But first, I can't resist. I got this wild idea the other day. Before we get into each of these basic enjoyments, and eventually to that little a that we started with in the middle when we got out the yellow pen, before we get into all this, just because we're right on the verge of taking a thought to the next level, I want to work through something with you here at the end of this lecture. You heard me say that meaning occupies an intersectional whole, or absistence, between the imaginary and the symbolic. And absistence that is also, interestingly, an outside or existence relative to the real. That's the weird thing about meaning, right? It occupies an intersectional whole or absistence between the imaginary and the symbolic, a whole that is also outside or existent relative to the real. And the same logic holds for JA and J phi in this diagram. Each occupies an intersectional whole or absistence that is also external or existent to another register. Which brings me to my question here. What exactly is the relationship between absistence and existence in Lacan's planar diagram of the Borromean knot? How is the whole fundamentally related to existence? Again, you need only recall the topology of the torus. Absistence describes a withdrawn or held back presence within the torus. A held back presence within that can only appear as an absence, gap, lack, or void. An absence, gap, lack, or void that is not accidental but essential, which is to say, structural. It's the whole which defines this geometric object as a torus, the depths and contents of which we know not. We don't know the depth or the contents of this whole that defines this particular geometric object as a torus. Now, consider existence. I told you it refers to the open field beyond the torus, and thus also beyond its constitutive whole. Existence is an exterior space or domain, the range and limit of which we know not. Relative to what consists, I'm telling you, whether we're talking about the geometric object known as a torus or the circle that allows us to draw something of one. What absists within and exists beyond cannot be said to exist without the hyphen. You see, relative to what consists, what absists and exists beyond cannot be said to exist. It doesn't work that way. Which makes absistence and existence domains of inconsistence. Or better, non-existence, aka non-being. Notice how this all falls into place. If consistence is ontic and ontological, absistence and existence are meontic and meontological. Why? Because they're not about the being of objects, objectivity, but instead the non-being of certain openings, what middle Lacan would call objectality. Psychoanalysis as the study of causes, and causes for Lacan are fundamentally openings. The word he uses for that is objectality. Is psychoanalysis a science? You bet your ass it is. But it is not interested in objectivity. It is instead interested in objectality. Not the stuff we seek, but the lacks that compel our search. And don't forget, in the midst of all this sistence talk, for Lacan, absistence and existence are intimately related. No absistence, no existence. No whole in what consists, no outer domain beyond. And not just intimately related. More precisely, sorry to introduce another $20 word here, I would say that these two domains, interior and exterior, are extimately related. Why? Because the whole inside the torus and each of Lacan's registers is also open to the outside, continuous with the open field beyond. Search any image of a torus, and you'll see what I mean. The whole inside is also open to the outside. It is continuous with the open field beyond. I'm no mathematician. Ask your local mathematician. If they know anything about knots, even better. I think, though, there's a kind of paradox at work here. The whole is constitutive of the torus and the circle alike. Yet it isn't in the torus or the circle the way that matter can be in something. But nor is this whole outside the torus like a surrounding space. I think the whole is weird like that. It's a tunnel more than a hole, even if you think about it. A topological threshold condition, I would say. But like I said, that's beyond me. That's just all too fancy for me. I can go the sistence route with you, but you start talking about topological threshold conditions, I don't know, man, a little bit of smoke coming out of one ear and a little bit of blood coming out of one nostril. I start talking like that. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of this real quick. If we're able to hold this thought in mind about an extimate relation between the whole in the torus and the beyond with which it's continuous, I think we can suggest something like this. Absistence and existence are connected by a structural logic. And I think we can call it something. I think we can come up with another name for this. And I don't know if you're going to like this one, but at least it's more readily apparent in that dictionary ripped from all those trees. I would call it inexistence. The logic that connects the whole to existence, absistence to what is beyond consistence, you can call it in-x-sistence. And you can pronounce it in existence. This in-x logic, connecting non-existence within to non-existence without, I think it's an important one. Maybe we'll abandon it, but I think it's pretty useful here because a lot turns on our ability to connect the holes in this diagram to the existences around them. At issue here is an in-x logic in which absistence and existence are connected by a topological tunnel of sorts, a tunnel of non-existence, I would say, of non-being, that passes through bounded existence into unbounded existence. Now, to cinch it all up, I want you to take all the so-called holes in Lacan's Borromean diagram: life, death, the body, meaning, other enjoyment, and phallic enjoyment. Indeed, all the holes but one, here the one labeled little a. Take them each and read them as tunnels into various fields of existence, including, especially, each other. 3 tunnels in particular suggest themselves at this point in our study of Seminar 22. Meaning functions as an intersectional whole in the imaginary and the symbolic, but it also tunnels inexistently into the domain of real life. And you could also say vice versa. Other enjoyment, here written JA, functions as an intersectional whole in the imaginary and the real, but it also tunnels inexistently into symbolic death, and again, vice versa. phallic enjoyment. The same logic applies. It functions as an intersectional whole in the real and the symbolic, but it also tunnels inexistently into the body imagined, and vice versa. And all we're doing here at the end of things is just following Lacan's logic. This is where the logic leads. And maybe this is as far as we need to go at this point with this logic. All this sistence, like I said, when I got into meontology and the smoke and the blood, it's a mess at this point. Maybe this is as far as we need to go with this. Maybe we follow Lacan's logic to this point and then get back to work in more familiar furrows and see how far this logic gets us. Don't forget, we've got an economy of jouissance still to figure out. And it's to that economy that we now turn.